monthly. Oh, got the slides mixed up already. Sorry, bit of it's hard to run it alone. Okay. Um, welcome. Hi, welcome to everyone. I welcome everyone to this month's webinar, Feeling Tomorrow, the Asia South Association series. We have got quite a interesting panel today coming from SkyNRG and NexantECA. Um, Apologies if you got a bit confused at the beginning, but we will get things rolling quite quickly. For the audience unattended, ASAPA is the Asia's first independent neutral nonprofit industry association, fully dedicated to aviation decarbonization. In the past, I guess 10 months or so, we've been growing quite nicely. We bring together again the entire fuel sustainable fuel ecosystem from airlines, fuel producers, technology licensors, feedstock aggregators, investors, OEMs, and really trying to really achieve decarbonization at scale. We also regularly involve policymakers to really take a bigger, bolder step in terms of SAF implementation, and we really expand the entire Asia Pacific region. Those two photos are from our events back in a few months ago, back in Bangkok and back in Tokyo. You'll see more and more events coming soon. In fact, if you're a subscriber, you know that come November, we're going to have our first One Sky Policy Summit here in Singapore, where we expect at least about 400 people from policymakers, industry to come together to really discuss the future of a One Sky for Asia Pacific. With that, we'll kind of skip this a bit, but we really stress that the SAF story, it's really at its infancy. We really need all hands on the deck to really drive the industry forwards where it comes to just building capacity, expertise, building new plants. We believe all technologies are needed to make this happen. Be it, we've seen obviously HEFA technologies across the region. We expect ATJ projects, Fisher Tropsch projects, synthetic fuels, PTL projects to come to the play. We also believe to make that all happen, we need to mobilize capital and just really general support for this whole ecosystem. And with that, we kind of showcase that now we have 26 international members and partners across the whole ecosystem. With us online today is called SkyNRG, and we really quite pleased to announce the newest partner to come on board is actually SAF Association at the right bottom corner out of India. Um, if you have visited their LinkedIn website, they actually this week had a big so-called event in India, and we were actually involved in the event as well. India is a really fast-growing market because there's so much biofuels being produced, and they're really looking at SAF as the next big thing for them. We still also like to kind of ask the audience here kindly grab your phones while you're listening in to really take our first APEC SAF Outlook survey. In conjunction with Argus Media, we really like to kind of seek your views when it comes to where the future of SAF will be, whether it's policy, whether it's the technology, the state of the technology, feedstocks. We really like to understand what you are thinking. And the idea is to really compile all these insights into a public document in our annual SAF Pacific or Asia Pacific SAF Outlook document, which will be out in November. So we really appreciate your views here to make this happen. So far, with about 50 respondents, we need more. So all views are really welcome. The, the survey is also available in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. So really reaching out to again the broader community to make this happen. With that, we also like to seek your support. End of today's webinar might run a bit longer because there's so much content to go through it. But we really hope that you can put in a survey to make future events better and to just, get to learn more about the whole SAF ecosystem. Feel free to leave your comments. With that, also kind of touch on next month, we'll have a very interesting topic of about net zero through CDRs and how direct air capture can really play a bigger role in the whole SAF ecosystem. We haven't got all the photos, but we will have the regional director, Sylvia Low, Philip New from the UK, and other speakers joining us for this panel. So keep, if you haven't signed up, this is the best chance to do so. And with that, here's our website, the QR codes to kind of go to the LinkedIn page. Please follow us. And really want to hand the floor to our esteemed speakers today, and we'll kick off with Nexant ECA actually, FGA Nexant ECA, to Clive and Connie. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me and see me loud and clear. My name is Clive Gibson. I lead Nexant ECA's Asian consulting activities. And with my colleague Connie today, we're delighted to have the opportunity to guide you through our webinar, which is titled Flight Path to Net Zero. If we just look at the agenda of the materials that we'll cover today, we'll be providing a comparative overview of technology developments. So we'll look at some of the trends amidst the major SAF production pathways, their key differences, including cost, technology readiness, and potential emissions reduction. And then in addition, we'll cover regional variations in feedstocks, evolving regional policies, and how they are impacting on project developments to give you an overview of how things are shaping the SAF landscape as we are moving forward. Before we do that, just a quick overview of Nexant ECA for those of you who may not be familiar with us. We're a leading independent provider of market, technical, environmental and commercial advisory support to the global energy and chemical sector. We've been around for over 60 years of institutional knowledge and more than 100 experts. And essentially, we offer integrated solutions which comprises consulting, subscription reports, and training services to the industry. So our expertise spans oil and gas, hydrocarbons, chemicals, and really importantly for today, and increasingly, sustainability and also the role of the circular economy and how that fits into our energy and chemicals landscape. What do we do in terms of our typical capabilities? Our main services cover technology assessments, technical evaluations. We have a broad range of engineers across our business. We undertake commercial analysis, which covers in-house market and pricing forecast profitability using very well-established methodologies. We undertake strategic planning, feasibility studies, and transaction support, which typically relates to technical, commercial, environmental, and social due diligence activities. And much of that really encompasses our work in the SAF space. And maybe I'd say that one of our key differentiators really is our active involvement in SAF projects through planning, through successful implementation, and the operation stages of those projects. And that means that a lot of our insights that we offer to our clients are driven and are based around the reality of projects which are being or have been developed. One final point to add. In 2025, Nexant ECA has recently merged with FGE to form FGE NexantECA. That combines our expertise in energy and chemicals on the Nexant ECA side with FGE's market intelligence, which is primarily focused around crude oil, refined products, and gas markets. That merger has been made possible by investment from TA Associates. It doubles our size. And it creates a comprehensive and growing consulting and market intelligence offering across the entire energy value chain. And we very much hope to support a number of our clients and hopefully a number of people on this call using our new FGE NexantECA combined offering. So let's get into the content of the presentation. We'll give a quick introduction first, and in terms of just to put SAF in context, by way of introduction, if we look at global CO2 emissions by sector, and I'm sure some of you will be very familiar with these types of numbers, but transport accounts for around 20% of total emissions globally. Within the transportation sector, aviation contributes around 10% of that subset. And so that translates to around 2% of global CO2 emissions is being derived from the aviation industry. It's a small percentage, but it's a very difficult percentage to address in terms of technology challenges and breakthroughs to enable and facilitate a significant reduction in carbon emissions from the aviation sector. And of course, that's driven by the fact that there are very limited alternatives. So we know the challenges of electric aircraft, we know the challenges of hydrogen as a fuel, etc. And sustainable aviation fuel is very much a solution which is here now and can grow over time to support the entire industry in its ultimate goal of substantial reduction of carbon emissions, ultimately towards achieving a net zero objective. So within that context, let's start by having a look at technology and see where technology is today and where we believe it's moving to. Before we look at the individual routes, let's just highlight that essentially the aviation industry has established rigorous standards for SAF pathways. There are a number of currently approved pathways under ASTM standards. So there are 8 technology pathways, and there are another 3 co-processing standards, and we'll talk about co-processing separately during the presentation. Each pathway essentially has specific feedstock requirements and limitations. It has maximum blend limits with conventional jet fuel. And this standardization is essentially all targeted at making sure the industry remains safe and any blended fuel can be used in existing aircrafts without modifications to engines or indeed infrastructure. Additional pathways are under development. And of course, technology will always continue to evolve, and we'll highlight 1 or 2 of those as we move through the presentation slides. So let's start off by looking at maybe the 4 main technology pathways that some of you will, I'm sure, be familiar with. These technologies are very much developing and evolving. If we start off with HEFA, it's the dominant route today in terms of SAF production. It's commercialized at large scale. It uses waste-derived oils, UCO, tallow, palm-based waste, etc. And plants are typically of a scale of around 200,000 tonnes all the way up to 1 million tonnes per year. The key issue with HEFA is the availability of waste feedstock, as well as collection and the logistics infrastructure involved with getting the feedstock from its source through to the production facility itself. Next on the list is alcohol to jet. This process is at a slightly earlier stage of commercialization than HEFA. We expect that there will be new plants starting up in this decade, before the end of this decade. The process basically uses ethanol or isobutanol as a feedstock. The plants are somewhat smaller, at least those currently being considered, than HEFA. Typically, scales under consideration around 100 to 300,000 tonnes per year. And the main issue, once again, comes back to feedstock. Slightly different issue. It's primarily here with, for example, the ethanol. So if you're using a first generation ethanol, which is typically derived from a food-based crop, then that will not be eligible for SAF qualification in markets such as the EU. If you use an advanced ethanol technology, which can use cellulosic material, that still requires some degree of technology advancement to allow the plants to capture economies of scale and to improve and achieve viable production economics. Those 2 are really most advanced technologies today. If we move further down to biomass gasification and Fischer-Tropsch technology is obviously well established in areas like gas to liquids, for example. But the adjustment here is basically on the feedstock side again. We're using biomass. It could be crop waste, could be forest residue, could be municipal solid waste. The benefits are the abundance of those feedstocks. The challenges are how you collect those feedstocks and the logistics associated with moving potentially hundreds of thousands of tonnes of solid waste to the production facility itself. And then finally, power to liquids, also referred to as e-fuels. Similar to the Fischer-Tropsch process in that ultimately we're producing hydrogen, let's say we're utilizing hydrogen and CO2. In this case, it's green hydrogen and it's captured CO2 to make synthesis gas. And then that is being converted via the Fischer-Tropsch process to high quality sustainable aviation fuel. This route has the most potential for carbon reduction, and we'll see that on subsequent slides, but it has a number of challenges, primarily relating to CapEx and also constraints around the availability of renewable power and the cost of capturing CO2, etc. So each of these pathways has very much different levels of commercial readiness, HEFA being the most mature, and e-fuels or power to liquids the least developed at present. Another key option to mention is co-processing. So some existing crude oil refineries are able to co-process waste-based feedstocks in their oil refineries to produce a blended jet product, which includes a proportion of sustainable aviation fuel. That blending and processing is typically focused around the hydrotreater units in refineries. So you may typically see refiners feeding in a small slipstream of waste material into those hydrotreaters to enable them to qualify to produce some of their product as a sustainable aviation fuel. In Asia Pacific, we are seeing a number of refiners who have either trialed or have implemented this co-processing approach. The advantages are it does not need grassroots investment in a dedicated facility. So it's faster move to market. And it also gives you more feed flexibility in the sense that you don't need as much feedstock to be able to start producing SAF. And you have more flexibility in the event that that feedstock source is not stable in terms of its quantities, that you have the ability to vary the amount within certain agreed limits, which may include your own operating constraints in order to manage your overall SAF production. If we look at some of the more details around each of the technologies, we can see that many of the modular aspects of each of these technologies are actually well established. So if we look at HEFA, for example, we're looking at pre-treatment of oils, fats, and greases, something which has been commonly done around biodiesel, for example. We're looking at hydrogenation and deoxygenation, and then isomerization and selective hydrocracking, which are common refinery processes before we achieve the final product recovery. The main product is SAF, but there is flexibility to produce renewable diesel as well, and operators can typically swing between the two. And there are byproducts which are renewable naphtha and renewable LPG produced in much smaller quantities. But HEFA producers typically have a degree of flexibility in terms of how they operate their plants between a maximum SAF mode or a maximum renewable diesel mode. Alcohol to jet, again, it involves dehydration of an alcohol, oligomerization, hydrogenation, and then product recovery. So again, these are technologies which are established, but they're being put together in a slightly different modular arrangement to allow the operator to produce SAF, renewable diesel, and renewable naphtha. So again, there is a bit of flexibility in terms of how operators can drive their plant yields to meet market requirements. Fischer-Tropsch biomass gasification route, again, the main difference here is really around, in terms of compared to established technologies at least, is around the pre-treatment and gasification of the biomass. From there on, it's very similar to a gas to liquids type technology in terms of how the material is handled, the synthesis, and the refining and cracking of the material, essentially to produce high quality liquids. And again, there is flexibility there around optimizing the yield between sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, and renewable naphtha. So while each of these pathways has unique characteristics, they do all leverage established chemical processes, which are configured specifically for renewable feedstocks. If we take a look at power to liquids, e-fuels, then there are really two major technical conversion routes. The first is, again, a Fischer-Tropsch derived route, which, as I mentioned earlier, is basically using renewable power for electrolysis to produce green hydrogen. And that's combined with captured CO2, which is ultimately used to produce a syngas, which is then processed through the Fischer-Tropsch route to provide a similar range of products to those that I mentioned earlier. The alternative route is methanol, which is basically a pathway that again uses electrolysis to produce hydrogen. That's combined with CO2 to produce methanol. And then there is a methanol to jet process that allows you to produce SAF as an e-fuel. The first route, the Fischer-Tropsch route that I mentioned, is already approved as a technology pathway through ASTM. The methanol pathway is currently under review for approval, and we would expect that to be ultimately approved prior to any commercialization at a significant scale of that technology route. At NexantECA, we've conducted extensive technology evaluations of both the pathways and the available licensed technologies, often as part of feasibility studies or as part of pre-financial close assessments before projects reach final investment decision and sources of funding are confirmed. And that's allowed us to provide some very real comparisons of the technologies, and we'll list some here. We'll talk about some more broader comparisons that we've drawn from our analysis. So in terms of HEFA, it's clearly the lowest capital and operating costs. Clearly today it has the highest degree of commercialization. Therefore, it has excellent bankability because you're fundamentally using proven technologies. In terms of carbon emission reductions, we'll see in a couple of slides' time, it offers some emission reduction opportunities. It's very heavily dependent on the nature of the feedstock which is being used. Alcohol to jet will be higher capital cost. It will have higher OPEX than HEFA. Obviously, right now it has a lower degree of commercialization, which is an increased risk in terms of new project developers looking to consider investment, as well as financiers looking to provide funding for these types of projects. It can offer good carbon emission reductions, particularly where the feedstock is waste derived, as I mentioned earlier, crop waste, forestry residues, rather than food-based crop derived ethanol. Moving further across to the right, biomass gasification and Fischer-Tropsch, higher capital cost, higher operating expenses, less level of commercialization, but can offer good carbon emission reductions where we are using fundamentally agricultural waste, for example. And then finally, on the right-hand side, power to liquids and e-fuels, it has the highest capital cost, it has the highest OPEX. It's certainly got the lowest degree of commercialization at this point in time, but it does offer the best carbon emission reductions, potentially up to 100%. So we would expect over time, and this is reflected in EU mandates, for example, there is going to be a lot of focus on improving the overall economics of e-fuels, the power to liquids options, to provide a viable source of 100% emission reduction. That's going to need improvements and enhancements, obviously, in green hydrogen technologies and production economics, as well as enhancements and improvements in production, or I should say in the costs of carbon capture. So the choice of pathway will ultimately depend on a wide range of regional factors, available feedstocks, the policy incentives in place in that region, and of course the overarching sustainability goals. Just to illustrate the positioning in terms of production costs as we've seen it recently, Here we compare a cost of production for SAF on 2024 basis in Western Europe. We're comparing HEFA versus alcohol to jet versus the Fischer-Tropsch e-fuels pathways. And if you look at the main components of production cost, you can see very quickly that in the first three technologies, the raw material, the feedstock, is ultimately the primary production cost component. So that could be the cost of your used cooking oil, of your palm waste, of your ethanol, etc., or even your biomass. Of course, for power to liquids, e-fuels, it's primarily down to renewable power costs. And we show that here under utility costs, whether that be derived from solar or wind, etc. If we go on to look at carbon emissions, I touched on this briefly, but if you look at the various options that you have here, as I mentioned, power to liquids and e-fuels potentially offers you up to 100% reduction. The other technology pathways typically can offer you somewhere between around 30 to 85% reduction in carbon emissions. That's going to be dependent primarily on your feedstocks that are being processed. It's also going to be dependent on your source of hydrogen and whether that's coming from green sources or conventional feedstock sources. It's going to depend on your sourcing of utilities, again, in terms of whether it's renewables or more conventional, as well as the nature of design and the logistics arrangements associated with your overall project. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Connie, who's going to start off by talking a little bit about some of the differentiations around feedstocks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Clive. I will take it from here, and we will start off with the feedstock side for SAF. Let's look now at how the CORSIA, which is the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation framework, classifies different feedstocks for SAF production, with each category carries different implications in its carbon intensity, especially when we consider indirect land use change, or ILUC for short. First of all, let's have a look at the primary products, which includes vegetable oils, well-known ones such as rapeseed, soybean, palm, and even camelina and jatropha. Alongside these, we see ethanol-related feedstocks such as corn grain, sugar beet, sugar cane, and molasses. And additionally, energy crops like switchgrass, poplar fall into this category. Next, we look at the byproducts category. These are secondary outputs from other industries like the palm fatty acid distillates, PFAT, technical corn oil, and animal fats such as beef tallow and poultry fat. What makes these valuable is that they don't compete directly with food users. Moving on, we look at the waste types of feedstock. This is where we see some of the most promising low carbon opportunities, whether it is in UCO, used cooking oil, municipal solid waste, and even waste gas. Waste gases are unwanted gaseous byproducts from industrial and biological processes that are typically vented or flared. And finally, we have residues. These come from agriculture, forestry, and processing industries. These materials are often left unused or discarded, so capturing their energy value provides both economic and environmental benefits. Now, the takeaway from here is that not all feedstocks are equal. Under CORSIA, the emphasis is on low carbon intensity sources, particularly waste and non-edible oils. Availability is also a very crucial factor because scaling of SAF production depends not only on the type of feedstock, but also on how much of it can realistically be accessed. So now let's turn here to the carbon intensity performance of the different feedstocks used for SAF production. Looking first on the left-hand side are the HEFA pathway, which uses oils and fats, and the chart shows here that used cooking oil and tallow could achieve around 80%, up to 80% reduction in emissions compared to its fossil fuel counterparts. On the other hand, if we look at palm-based feedstock, such as crude palm oil, it could potentially only deliver about 14% reduction. This is much lower performance. It's partly due to the land use implications tied to palm cultivation, which adds to the overall carbon footprint. Moving to the right-hand side of the chart, we see the alcohol-to-jet pathway, which uses feedstocks such as sugars and lignocellulosic materials. We see a slightly different picture here. Agricultural residues, forest residues, and dedicated energy crops like switchgrass and miscanthus typically could deliver between 40 to 70% reduction compared to fossil fuel. However, if we look at first-generation feedstocks like corn grain, that performs much worse. In fact, corn grain ethanol-to-jet or alcohol-to-jet SAF is shown here as being roughly equivalent to fossil fuels in terms of emission reduction, which really highlights the importance of feedstock choice. It's really important to note, though, these values are averages or estimates because real-world carbon intensity is really dependent on site-specific and project-specific parameters, and factors such as cultivation practices, regional supply chains, and energy inputs can all shift the actual results. And because of these differences, policy frameworks increasingly prioritize waste-based feedstock. For example, in the EU, first-generation feedstocks are excluded from SAF mandates, which means that only low-carbon waste and residue feedstocks can qualify. In the US, however, with the new Clean Fuel Production Credit effective by 2026 next year, it excludes ILUC emissions, which actually benefits corn ethanol ATJ producers. And in Asia Pacific, while the first generation SAF is still possible, the trend appears to be moving closer towards waste-based feedstock such as through policies, although these policies remain more fragmented and are still evolving as of today. So the key message I want to deliver here is that waste and residue feedstocks not only deliver the strongest carbon savings, but it also aligns most closely with emerging policy framework. While first-generation crops can still play a role in certain countries, the long-term trajectory for SAF points firmly towards waste and residue-based solutions. In Southeast Asia, for example, over here in this chart, we see a clear shift as well towards waste-based feedstocks for SAF. It's where I come from in Malaysia. Petronas has announced plans to develop its SAF facility from UCO and palm oil mill effluent. They have also launched a UCO buyback program at selected petrol stations since 2023, where households can sell UCO for cash. And companies like Fat Hope's Energy in Malaysia have become key regional player in waste feedstock aggregation. In Singapore, for example, Neste's facility is another strong example here. More than 90% of Neste's global SAF feedstock portfolio today comes from waste and residues, which includes UCO, animal fats, and other byproducts. In Thailand, for example, the national oil company PTT, as well as Bangcha, are building UCO collection networks. For example, Bangcha has recently announced its partnership with Sumitomo to develop a UCO to SAF supply chain. As in Indonesia, we see that Pertamina is also planning to shift away from palm kernel oil and towards waste oil such as UCO as a primary SAF feedstock in its co-processing facility. The company also intends to build its own collection networks in future. Moving along here, I will delve a little bit onto policy and industry drivers. So looking here, following the lead of the US and EU, there are a range of policy measures relating to the uptake of renewable fuels, as well as SAF has subsequently been introduced in APEC in recent years. To start with this, I will look at first of all in the US, where the focus is mainly on incentives or like a carrot, right? Programs such as the Renewable Fuel Standard, the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, and the SAF Grant Challenge have created opportunities for producers to stack credits and lower production costs. In contrast to this, we see in the EU as well as UK take more of a stick approach, setting binding mandates with penalties or buyout prices for non-compliance. In APAC, we are now seeing a wave of announcements from countries like Singapore, Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, South Korea, and India. These targets generally start modestly around 1% and then scale up gradually. It's important to, however, note that most of these are targets rather than binding mandates. And while policies are still under development, the direction suggests closer alignment with the EU model rather than the US incentive-led framework. So now, outside the government policy, the aviation industry itself is playing a critical role in driving SAF adoption. Both IATA and ICAO have pledged to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Looking at IATA's net zero 2050 strategy, if you see the pie chart, about 65% of emission reductions are expected to come from SAF, with the remainder is split across new technologies such as electric and hydrogen aircrafts, infrastructure and operational efficiencies, as well as offsets, including carbon capture. But here's the challenge, right? While the targets are ambitious, actual SAF consumption is expected to fall well short of IATA's projections. Meeting IATA's 2050 target would require around 350 million tons of SAF annually, compared to what we have today, which is just a few million tons. This highlights really the significant demand potential, but also the scale of gap that must be closed. The Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, better known as CORSIA, is a global cap and trade system designed specifically for aviation. It requires airlines to offset their emissions against a baseline set at 85% at 2019 levels. Airlines can meet their obligations in two ways. Either one, by purchasing CORSIA eligible emissions unit, which are essentially carbon offsets, or by using CORSIA eligible fuels. The scheme has been rolled out in phases. From 2021 through 2026, participation is voluntary, but beginning 2027, CORSIA becomes mandatory for most international flights. And several major APAC airlines, as shown on the right side, have already set SAF targets aligned with CORSIA in preparation for the compliance phase. With here now, I move a little bit on capacity development. While most of today's SAF capacity is still based on HEFA technology, as Clive pointed out earlier, there is growing interest in non-HEFA pathways such as ATJ, FT, and PTL pathways. These pathways are essential to diversify supply and reduce dependence on the limited waste oils and fats. Some examples I could give you are like, for example, in the US, LanzaJet's Freedom Pines facility in Georgia would be the world's first commercial-scale ethanol-to-jet plant. However, the project has reportedly faced some challenges, including delays in commissioning, and the fact that it currently uses imported ethanol makes it ineligible to date for the new US 45Z tax credit under the new administration. There's also the GEVO's Net Zero 1 project in South Dakota in the US, which is still under development. GEVO plans to use domestic corn ethanol as feedstock, but integrate renewable electricity and carbon capture to drive down life cycle emissions. In Europe, we see, including the UK, SAF from food and feed crops are ineligible to count towards mandates, hence driving development towards waste-based, ATJ, and also power to liquid projects. Here in Asia, while HEFA still dominates, There are a number of developers which are focusing on non-HEFA projects, each leveraging on their unique feedstock base. As an example here, for Japan, for example, is looking at developing ATJ capacity, initially importing sugarcane ethanol from Brazil, while preparing to transition to waste-based ethanol and eventually eSAF. India has a strong potential from its sugar industry, especially sugarcane juice and molasses, which can also feed into ATJ projects. In Australia, there are two projects worth mentioning here, which highlights Australia's focus in non-HEFA development. For one is Jet Zero's Project Ulysses, which is in feed stage based on agricultural byproduct ethanol. There's Wagner's Sustainable Fuels. It's also developing a waste such as a municipal solid waste to SAF production facility project in collaboration with LanzaJet and LanzaTech. New Zealand, there are feasibility studies suggest that its woody biomass residues could supply up to 25% of domestic jet demand via ETJ pathways. Thailand already produces large volumes of ethanol from sugar or molasses base, which could also be redirected to SAF production with right policy support. Likewise, Philippines and Vietnam, there's strong potential in sugarcane, cassava, agricultural residues such as bagasse and rice husks. Closer to home, in Malaysia and Indonesia, there are abundant of palm residues and agricultural byproducts could be converted to ethanol for ATJ, provided there is domestic collection system and conversion facilities are scaled. And finally, China. China's focus today is almost entirely on HEFA, but there is research already underway evaluating non-HEFA pathways as part of its longer-term decarbonization strategy. So with here, I'd like to do a few takeaways, key takeaways for our webinar. To summarize, most of the world's production capacity is still dominated by HEFA, but non-HEFA pathways are advancing and expected to scale significantly post-2030. Feedstock availability is still a challenge. UCO supply, however, is limited and fragmented compared to conventional oil, and there is a need to diversify to meet this growing demand. Policy will remain a decisive factor. Across APAC, while the momentum is growing, most policies remain at roadmap or target rather than binding mandates. Economics remain a critical hurdle. SAF today is still roughly 3 times more expensive than conventional fossil fuel jet, but with continued innovations, scaling of production, and stronger policy support, this cost gap is expected to narrow over time. And finally, in short, the pathway to net zero in aviation is clear. First, we need to scale up SAF, diversify feedstocks with innovative technologies, and ensure global policy alignment. With these elements in place, the aviation sector's net zero ambition is certainly well within reach. And here, I thank you.
Wow, it's quite a lot to take in, and we'll open up the floor to some questions for Clive and Connie. Feel free to type it in the chat box, and there might be a few questions around technology about I can just ask a few to kick things started. You showed the slide with many well-known technology licenses, right? We also understand there's also, I guess, new players coming to the market, tech startups, and even Asian technology companies. Do you have any insights into that part of the industry? Because we see a lot of exciting projects in eSAF and newer technologies. How is it like?
So I think you're right that we are certainly seeing other emerging technologies and technology developers providing and offering their solutions into the industry. The challenge of any of these new technologies is firstly dealing with degree of commercialization and achieving or demonstrating achievement of certain performance benchmarks And that's really critical when it comes down to attracting investors or the finance community to supporting these projects as they develop and grow up. I think the other fundamental issue, which less so in SAF in terms of HEFA development, but certainly in some of the other sustainable plays around the world, is critical. It is the production cost economics. So if the production costs don't make sense, it's very difficult to get the necessary incentives, policies, etc., to help facilitate those particular new technologies. And so it's really important that any of the new and evolving technologies can be scaled up, they can be commercialized, and they can demonstrate that within the existing sort of SAF environment, they are economically viable.
Thank you for that.
We Gabriel, sorry. Yeah, hello. Hey, hi, Connie and Clive. I have a question also as well on the methanol to jet, because you presented that pathway saying that it's still to be certified. We're hearing that for the last at least 1 year, maybe potentially more, that this pathway is under recognition. So, would you be able to share a bit more insight about when and if we can expect it to be certified and when we expect to be certified? We all know it's a long process, right? But
yeah, I don't have specific insights that I can share now, but what I can say in terms of the overall commercialization of that technology is ultimately still going to take time, right? And a key element of that will be the underlying economics for that technology and making sure it's viable from an economic perspective. We've been involved in, less so in Asia, but in Europe, we've been involved in projects which have been looking at e-fuels, obviously based around the mandates that the EU has in place for the next 20 years, etc. And one of the big challenges is getting the economics to be sufficiently viable that the projects can actually be financed and can go ahead. And there's still uncertainty from that perspective in terms of how you can ensure that the necessary economics are in place to ensure that financing can be offered and it can ultimately be repaid with a reasonable degree of certainty and not undue risk.
Yes, thank you, Clive.
A few questions coming in, but I think one would like to get online to say something, but mute them. You can speak now.
Hello.
Vink? Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Good to hear from you.
Yeah. Hi. So I had this one question regarding corn. So the carbon intensity is going to be quite high with corn. So how are we going to treat corn? Like one of the speakers said that in the US, the life cycle analysis would not be an issue with corn. So how are we as a world treating corn based ethanol and the SAF coming out of it?
So I think it's going to be a somewhat political decision, right? So in the US, ethanol, corn-based ethanol, was highly promoted by the agricultural sector, initially for blending into gasoline, and has been very successful. And that's met a combination of needs, and potentially corn-based ethanol can play a similar role in supporting a sustainable aviation fuel need as well. If we look across to the EU, then clearly that is not the direction that the EU has moved with their policies. They are clearly only supportive of alcohol-based routes if the feedstock to the ethanol is basically being derived from waste. And in other markets, it's kind of wait and see, I think, in terms of how the markets may evolve. But I think in many markets, I would expect them to follow a route of using available renewable feedstocks. And in some markets, that will inevitably involve corn-based ethanol, whilst in others, it's difficult to see them legislating against it I think it will simply be that they may not just be used compared to other viable alternatives.
So basically, what you're hinting out is that in the US, what happens if Corsia doesn't accept that? It could be technically SAF, but if it is not CEF, it's of no use to the airlines. So does it mean that the airlines would not uplift this the corn-based SAF?
I mean, I think this starts very quickly to become very political in terms of how governments and regulatory bodies decide to view these things. Ultimately, what the industry and what policy makers, regulators, and governments are trying to achieve is a reduction in carbon emissions. And I think you have to hope that that will be the overarching objective, which is sought by everybody in order to finalize these sorts of requirements.
I think maybe just to complement what Clive is saying is, remember that so Corsia, if your fuel is SAF is not Corsia compliant, then obviously the airlines won't use to offset their emissions under Corsia because that's not going to be recognized, right? So I think that's one topic, and that's why Clive mentioned it. The other one is we start to see more and more regulation at the domestic level, not yet at our regional level. If you talk about Europe, right? And as SAFA, we want to have this kind of domestic level ramping at the regional level as well, right? But on adoption of SAF, all right? Some of them have the same definition than Corsia for the SAF. Some of them have different definition. Europe has a different definition, for example. So we cannot exclude that if one country, and that's what Clive was saying about political decision, if one country like the US, for example, says, okay, then corn is eligible as a feedstock for me for what I call is not going to be SAF as per Corsia definition, but it will be a sustainable fuel for aviation or green fuel for aviation, the way you name it. Then you might want the airlines from that country might want to use it because if it's validated, right? So the question is at the domestic level, the standards might be different from the Corsia level. All right. Unfortunately, that's what we might want to avoid because that's not helping. But that's what's happening.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. We'd like to move on to the next speaker. Really thank the team. Please stay online. There's still a few questions, but Marlet, over to you.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry to keep you waiting.
No problem. It was super interesting to hear, of course.
Maybe a quick introduction for Marlotte.
Yes.
All right. So Marlotte, you're from SkyNRG, as people know. So you're project lead for advisory, where you and your team, you've been advising a broad range of clients across the aviation industry on sustainable aviation fuel, and you've been supporting the transition towards its adoption. You had a prior life before joining SkyNRG, and so you obtained a BSc, a business science in industrial engineering, and a Master of Science in econometrics. And you started your career as strategic consultant at Ben & Company, so which also explain why you're still on this advisory expertise, right? In recent months, you've been closely involved in the development of the SAF market outlook from SkyNRG 2024 version, which is a collaboration between SkyNRG and ICF, and that provide in-depth analysis of project SAF demand and product capacity, and explore the technology pathways required to meet the sector growing needs. And one last comment is also for SkyNRG. I think it's the first time that you include a dedicated section talking about Asia Pacific. So we're excited to hear more about you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very comprehensive introduction. I think better than I could have done it myself. And also, of course, thank you both for having me here. Very excited. And super cool also, Clive and Connie, to hear your views and the presentation just now. I think it builds on each other pretty well. So yes, Fabrice, you already mentioned it a little bit, but before we dive into the content, I wanted to give a little bit of a background on the market outlook itself. Basically, SkyNRG is a company that has been around in the SAF market for 15 years now. and it's as long as the SAF market has more or less existed. So we initially started as a sourcing and selling company of SAF, and now expanded our operations across the entire SAF supply chain. So we're advising companies on their R&D paths, but also companies on their SAF strategy and feasibility projects. And next to that, we're also currently building our own production facilities. So that's all super exciting. And that expansion into that SAF supply chain has also led us to publish the market outlook. We've been doing so for 5 years now, and this year we also partnered up with ICF, which is a well-known consultancy firm, and they brought in great knowledge and insights. So that's a little bit on the background of this market outlook. I'll go through the information today rather quickly. If you'd like to have a further read, the report is free, and you can download it on our website, SkyNRG.com. So now into the topics. What we will be discussing is, first of all, the SAF demand. We have created a forecast of SAF demand out until 2050. So how much can we expect, and also from which regions? Then secondly, we'll look into the 2035 SAF capacity outlook. So what do we actually see in terms of capacity that's going to be built, and where is that capacity again coming from? And then thirdly, we're looking into the HEFA tipping point, because as Connie and Clive already mentioned, HEFA feedstock potential is rather limited, and it's good to know when is actually the demand going to surpass that that limited feedstock potential, and how are we then going to start building up and ramping up the SAF market, right? Okay, so diving into the first topic, which is the SAF demand. And probably a lot of you already know this, and some of the information, of course, that I'll share is already mentioned in the previous slide, so then I'll go through it a little bit quicker. But actually demand consists out of 3 buckets. So the first one is mandates, which are policy enforced with legislations and penalties. So it's more of the stick, as I think Connie also mentioned, and that you can see in the EU and the UK. Next to that, we have government targets. For instance, in the US, they set a target, for instance, the Grand Challenge, to uptake around 10% of SAF by 2030. And that is then in some states supported by incentives. So that's more the carrot, as you can say. And these two really, if you look at how does that play out on a global level, these two really add up to each other. And then next to that, you also have industry pledges. So these are corporates, but also aircraft operators that make voluntary pledges of a SAF uptake. But what you really see is that if a airline makes a pledge and there's also a mandate in that same area, then the two will sort of absorb each other. But it is very good to say that we really need both of the sides, right? So we really need the policies and the targets to give certainty, but also the industry pledges, because those will really lead to, for instance, airlines taking offtake agreements, and that can really help in giving that certainty for investors to actually invest in SAF projects. So that's a little bit on the background. I'll first dive into the first 2 buckets and then into the third. But before we can actually do that, we first have to understand what is actually the jet fuel demand going to be in the upcoming years. And what we did here is we took a country-by-country approach. So first we looked at the historical jet fuel usages, and then also looked at changes in GDP, and then on a country-by-country level forecasted that out into 2050. And we also take factors such as alternative propulsion aircrafts into account. And then eventually this gives you a CAGR of 1.4%, which materializes into 440 MT in 2050 of jet fuel demand. So we're just below the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which is another body that creates these forecasts. So on the right-hand side, you can also see those other forecasts to give you a little bit of a feel of where we are. Now that we have a little bit of an understanding of, okay, what is the total jet fuel demand going to be? Then the question is, how can we go from that to a SAF demand, right? So we took the following steps. First of all, we looked at the 3 different demand drivers, so the mandates, national targets, and the industry pledges, as I earlier mentioned. And again, we look at a country-by-country basis of what is going on there and what kind of developments do we see. It is quite a hard exercise because, well, a lot of policies and pledges and targets are still under development. So that's why we took a scenario-based approach. So that's what you see in the middle. First off is the most bottom one. So it's actually the lowest scenario where we assume SAF uptake is only following existing mandates or pledges, and then with some minimal other ones. Then we took a more central scenario, more midline approach, which is called the current trend scenario. And here we're adding policies that are not yet implemented, but we know they're being actively discussed. And then in the top scenario, the accelerated actions, we assume national targets are met, and also there are coming online a lot of other policy developments that really push that demand even further. And then eventually, if you apply that on a country-by-country basis, you get the estimated SAF demand, which is basically looking like this. So the top line again is that high scenario, the light blue line is that current trend scenario, and the bottom line is that low scenario. So eventually this, for the mid scenario, will lead to 200 million tons of SAF by 2050, which means that equates to a roughly 45% SAF blend rate. And I'm sure you're all familiar now with IATA's pledges, and they actually set the goal towards net zero, and we really see that it then still falls short of the IATA blend rate. So we actually really need additional demand to reach that goal of net zero. Well, going forward throughout this presentation, we'll stick to that mid scenario, that light blue line. And if we detail that out a little bit further, we can see that most of the part is coming from targets, and the darker gray part is the currently mandated part. So by 2030, 4 MT is coming from mandated demand, and 11 MT is coming from regions that, well, either are developing mandates or have announced targets. And now coming back to the voluntary demand, so the industry pledges. Around 60 airlines globally have made SAF pledges, and that equates to 13 MT by 2030, 13 MT SAF. So you can really see that those voluntary pledges are actually almost at the same height by 2030 as the targets and mandates. And that's actually very, very great and a super good signal from the industry, because, as I said, it leads to more certainty also for investors to really actually start building those facilities. And that's, of course, what we actually need. Well, this gave a little bit of a feel of what the demand looks like, and we're also going to break it down into what the demand looks like per region. But we want to overlay that with what is then the capacity in each region. So that's why we're diving into the capacity outlook. And we do this exercise actually every year for the past 5 years, where we look at what kind of capacity can we expect. So we have quite a large and extensive database where we keep track of all the different production facilities that are either online or being announced. And then we take an approach into eventually getting a sort of self-output per region from that. So what we do is, based on that large database, we look at, okay, which projects are actually going to materialize and which projects are we actually going to take into account. So we exclude projects that are still very early in the feasibility stage or that have not publicly given updates over the past 2 years. And also we exclude projects that we believe as SkyNRG have a very high risk and are too complex. And then finally, as a third step, we also look at on a facility level basis, what the actual SAF output is going to be. And we make an estimation if we think that is too high or not. And that holds for both SAF only, but also for renewable diesel and SAF facilities. Because we know you have renewable diesel facilities that can switch between producing SAF or renewable diesel. And then we take estimations of we think what that split will be. So eventually that will lead to a SAF output per year up until 2035. And diving into some results already, as I said, we've been doing this for a couple of years. So we've discovered some trends as well on a regional basis. And I think the biggest trend that we saw this year is that for the first time ever, towards 2030, more projects have been delayed and cancelled than have been added. And in the EU, UK, and the US, you really see that that holds true. And for instance, in the US specifically, projects are typically bigger and they're only reliant on a couple of players. And so if a couple of players pull out, which they did, you can really see that steep decrease in capacity. The only exception is Asia, where we see quite a significant growth, where China is really in the lead there, but we'll go into those regions more one by one in detail. So first, what we want to do is give you a bit of a global picture. So combining actually everything together, it's a bit of a busy slide. So I'll walk you through it. First of all, on the background, in the gray sort of boxes, you see the global demand. And then in the foreground, you see the colored boxes, which is actually the capacity. And then it's divided by its technology pathway, which we all understand very well right now. So first thing that you can see is, as mentioned before, yeah, the industry is very reliant on HEFA still. So that's that light blue box. And then secondly, you can also see that the eSAF portion is still really, really small. So we're actually falling behind on working towards our mandates. But it's also very, yeah, logical because it's the most expensive pathway and still very complex. Then what I also wanted to mention is that in 2024, you can see that the actual supplied SAF was around 1 million ton in that year, even though there was 4 MT capacity. Few reasons for that. First of all, a few facilities came online later in the year, and we don't include like that ramp up time. So if we have a year, then we include the whole thing already for that year. So a couple of those facilities weren't able to produce full capacity. And then secondly, of course, the demand signals were still very weak. So actually towards 2030, we're in an oversupply situation. However, you can really see that that is changing very fast. So after towards 2035, the demand is really increasing steeply, and we actually need to develop more capacity to be able to come up with that, or to keep up with that. So this year we also looked into, okay, how are we in 2035 going to overcome that gap? And we've also done an assessment of what the portion could be of co-processing and that renewable diesel switching potential that I just mentioned. And if you look into that, and you can read this more in detail also in the report, you can see that together those can fill another 6 MT of the gap, but that's still not enough to meet the demand. So moving on towards 2030, we really need to start building that additional capacity as well. Then if we look at the same picture, but then from a regional perspective, we can see that North America is actually leading in terms of SAF capacity towards 2030. But we also see that Asia is really ramping up quickly. So over 40% of their capacity is in operational or under construction state. And they're also second behind towards 2030 in terms of how much capacity they have. Then third is Europe. So even though Europe has the strongest mandates, it's the third largest regional producer, and then followed by the rest of the world, where we really see LATAM, especially Brazil, picking up in capacity. So now diving a little bit further into those different regions. So first of all, the EU. Here we know, of course, we have the EU mandate for SAF, both SAF and eSAF, which you can see in the background again. And again, you can see that HEFA is dominating the capacity markets right now. We also, as mentioned, see that we're falling behind on our eSAF capacity. And again, that there's quite a big gap from 2030 to 2035. It's also harder in the EU because the mandates are going in steps. So by 2030, there's a 6% blend rate, and then that kicks in to 20% in 2035. So that's also very tricky for producers, right? To be able to, in that step approach, sort of build up the capacity as well. Then over to the US, I think it was raised already in the discussion just now. But yeah, interesting to see. There's a lot more focus, right, on agricultural feedstocks, so corn-based, and you can see that in the orange, so orange parts. And yeah, due to the regulatory tariffs, you can also see there's a shift towards those domestic feedstocks, which typically have a lower greenhouse gas savings. And again, that surge at the end towards 2035. Then moving on to Asia, which indeed is a region we now include in our outlook, which is very nice to have. Here we can see that the demand is rather limited up until 2028. So it will probably remain an exporting region. However, you can really see that that can change quickly, because we know, for instance, Japan, Singapore, but also China, right? There's speak of mandates, and this, if this really materializes, that sort of equilibrium could really shift quickly. So again, if you want to have a further read, I would advise you to download the report. But here's again a recap of what we just discussed. So the 2035 outlook, you see in the backgrounds in the light gray and the darker gray, again, the mandates and targets and where they take place. And then also the capacity outlooks. So we're actually indeed summarizing in a undersupply situation from 2035. Of course, 2035 is still far out. But seeing this and knowing, of course, those projects are often quite complex, they have long lead times, it really signals that we have to keep on building on to that capacity that we're building on already. So that was a little bit about the demand and the capacity that we see currently. And then we also added this year as a separate part, the HEFA tipping point. So this was a super cool exercise, really, really interesting. It took us a while to figure it all out, but eventually we managed. And also looking at the time, I'm gonna keep it a little bit short. So what I want to do is I want to first take you into the main assumptions that we took, and then the methodology, and then rather going to the methodology step by step, we're jumping right into the results, which is of course the more fun part. So first of all, the key assumptions, and I think this is now quite a familiar slide, but we're assuming that the capacity can come from 3 different types of feedstocks. So HEFA is the first one, then advanced bio, and then thirdly eSAF. And as you can see, the scalability of those sort of newer feedstocks is higher, but also the production cost is higher. And of course, this is a picture that's sort of true now, but it might fluctuate over time. And what we're assuming really here is that if there is a demand in a region, but there are no strict requirements in terms of what kind of feedstock they have to use, for instance, not as in the EU that there's a strict eSAF mandate. So if it's like feedstock agnostic, we assume it will follow this cost merit curve. So first of all, the HEFA feedstock will be used. So that's the key assumption driving this sort of effort. And then into the methodology. So what we did here, we actually split it up into 4 steps. So the first step is we looked on a global level, okay, what kind of demand is there? And then what kind of feedstock does that demand require? So for instance, as I mentioned, in the UK, you have a HEFA cap, right? In the EU, there's an eSAF mandate. We all took that into account and then build up what kind of demand is there in terms of feedstocks. And then actually you can see that really the biggest portion is feedstock agnostic. And there again, we assume HEFA will be used first to meet that demand. Then of course the second step is, but how much HEFA do we actually have? So we looked into waste oils, animal fat, oil cover crops, and vegetable oils. And then we estimated the availability up until 2050, and of course the aviation claim within that availability to eventually come to a HEFA SAF potential. And then in the third step, we overlaid the 2 images. So we looked at, okay, how much demand is there for HEFA and how much HEFA do we actually have? And then if you look at the overlaying of those 2 images, you can really see that from 2030 onwards, there's not enough HEFA anymore to fulfill that feedstock agnostic demand. So then the question really becomes, okay, how are we going to fill that gap? And that gap really widens to 123 MT in 2050. So it's really the question of, yeah, what is going to happen then? Because we know, of course, that the other pathways are, mainly also more expensive. So to understand what will happen, we also need to know what will happen in the policy landscape, right? Because that really drives the demand and the type of demand. So what we did there is we created 4 different scenarios. And what I'd like to do is to take you into those 4 scenarios and show the results. So you can see in the columns here the 4 different scenarios. And we looked into, okay, how are they in terms of policy support, but also what kind of sustainability requirements would they assume. So in the first 2, we have quite weak policy support. So we're assuming no strong push from the governments. And then next to that, in the first scenario, we also assume no requirements. So basically everything is eligible. And in the second scenario, we assume there is limited policy support, but the policy support that there is will exclude food and feed. Then in the third and fourth scenario, which are a little bit more optimistic, we assume either adequate or robust policy support and very high integrity sustainability criteria. So if you then let it play out, right? So if you then let it sort of run until 2050, what will then happen? And again, a little bit of a busy slide, but I'll take you through it. So let's first look at the non-waste growth scenario. Here we will see that some growth is possible, right? But without the strong demand pool coming from policies, supply will probably stagnate. So in the dark black line, you see what the current trend scenario actually is, and we see we actually fall short of that. We also see then that quite a lot of SAF is coming from agricultural-based feedstocks, which of course have lower CO2 reduction potential. And it's very interesting because if you look at the second scenario, where there is that higher integrity in terms of excluding food and feed, you can see that the absolute supply will be lower, because of course those feedstocks are not accepted, but they eventually have a higher reduction potential. So it's super important that it's not purely a basis of getting more SAF out there, but it's also getting the right SAF out there, right? Then in the third scenario, what we did is, okay, we see there's enough policy, but can we actually, with eSAF and also advanced bio, meet those policy demands? And you can read in the report in more detail, but actually there is, of course, we have to overcome some difficulties, but there is in theory enough potential to meet that rising demand. But we really need those policies to actually help unlock that feedstock potential. And the fourth the fourth scenario, which is the full potential, there we actually thought, okay, let's see whether or not, like, if we want all of the fossil jet demands to be fulfilled by SAF, can we actually do that as well? And we found that we can do that as well, which is a pretty cool exercise to do. So to reach the third and fourth sort of scenario, because that's of course what we want to aim to, we identified a couple of things that, as I said, still need to be overcome to actually be able to unlock that. And we bucketed them here. So first of all, in the first bucket, it's all about creating that stable market, right? So we need those long-term stable policy frameworks to define how much SAF needs to be produced. And without those strong signals, producers and investors are probably hesitant to commit. And then next to that, there also needs to be certainty, because on one hand, producers need to know for sure that the SAF demand is there, but of course, airlines fear SAF prices becoming too high. So mechanisms such as fixed price contracts or government-backed offtake agreements can really reduce those risks on actually both sides. Then secondly, infrastructure needs to be built out. It's mostly to do with feedstocks. For instance, to capture more HEFA potential, we really need to revive the agricultural sector as well, especially in the parts where there's no indirect land use change. And next to that, what you can also see is that there's a bit of a project-on-project risk. So for instance, eSAF facilities, they rely on green hydrogen, on captured CO2. And if your CO2 capturing or your green hydrogen facility is not ready yet, you cannot progress on that eSAF. So you need a party, typically, right, a government, to offer the guarantees to reduce those risks for early movers. And then thirdly, EPC and technology risks. These projects are really, really expensive, and it's very difficult for EPCs to wrap that alone. So financial opportunities in terms of guarantees and low interest loans have to be available to support this. So wrapping it all up, so these are the key takeaways of actually the complete market outlook. So first of all, demand is expected to triple between 2030 and 2035, but we see a slowing momentum, especially in Europe and in the US. And without that, robust SAF policy frameworks, after the HEFA tipping point, we are probably not going to be able to execute on the growth. So these two are quite alarming, but a very positive note is that if we really use all those, the right policies and really the right toolkits, we are able to, bring the SAF into a next step and contribute to our net zero ambition within aviation. That having all said, I'd also like to do a little bit of advertisement, of course, from our side. Already mentioned before, but we also support in advisory services So if you'd like to know more about what you just heard right now, or you're currently developing your own SAF strategy, feel free to reach out to us. We provide both self-intelligence, so really deep industry intelligence on like market, local policy developments, sustainability requirements, but also we help out in, for instance, SAF strategies, feasibility studies, etc. So with that 15 years of experience, we know the industry quite well. We have a lot of expertise, and we'd be happy to help out. Now I'd like to pause and open up the floor for some questions.
Thank you,
Thank
Marlotte.
you.
Very, very interesting. I think we all agree that HEFA is a low-hanging fruit and is very useful for the moment, but that we also need to look at what's next, right? So thanks for putting some figures and realistic approach on that one. All right, we have running late, so for the one still here, I think we have one question for you, I guess, which is the third one. I don't know if you can see it, or we're happy to share with you. So what level of confidence do we have with governments and corporates following through on their 2035 mandates when the gap between the forecasted supply and demand is so huge?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question, and also sometimes hard to predict, right? Because it's still out in the future.
No crystal ball.
Sorry?
Nobody has
ball.
crystal
Yeah,
ball,
indeed.
right? We hope so, but we'd love to.
Yeah. And I think that's why we actually need not only the government, but also the corporates and the airlines making their pledges, because then it all feeds into together and really secures that long-term demand. And of course, this is also something that, for instance, this year, the Refuel EU mandate kicked in, and step by step, we're detailing out sort of question marks that we did not know beforehand, that are now surging. So I would say we have quite a good level of confidence, also because there's that longer lead time and that step approach. But we do need the whole industry to really step up and feed towards that rising demand towards 2035. I hope that answers the question a little bit. And of course, when that demand is actually getting more and more tangible, then you can also see that. Sorry, I saw. Oh, that was you, Fabrice. Sorry.
Yep.
Then you also see that more and more producers are likely to step in and really take that investment risk, right? So it's a sort of tandem.
Yes, I think I like the fact that what you're highlighting again, and we had Clive and Connie also same at the beginning, right? Is that and we're talking about the chicken and egg. We're talking about, okay, who's going to start, but without a clear demand signals, nobody's going to invest, right? Whether you're financial or your producer. So we need that demand signals, and the demand signals is obviously supported by policies and government policies. So that's where we stand. And again, we were in India, in Thailand early this week. There was also events last week in Singapore. And I think the more we go, the more we say, everybody, all the industry is putting pressure on the governments to say, hey guys, we need to move into the policies. And because it's not a purely domestic topic, it's really more at least a regional, if not a global target. We need those policies to be aligned as much as possible together. And that's basically why the raison d'etre of SAFA, right? And that's why SkyNRG is a member of SAFA, is that we need that regional approach also on the nation level, right? So we need to stimulate the market. I mean, there's no other way. And that's what happened with other renewable energies, or like electricity, before solar panels, winds, etc. So we had also very strong policy signals that supported the necessary investment to reduce the price for the production of those energies. So we need also similar approaches.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying in that similarity, because that's also what you saw in the different policies, or sorry, the different scenarios after the HEFA tipping point, is we don't globally take the same approach, the market can actually not scale as it should, right?
Yes.
So I really, yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah.
All right. Do we have any more questions, Gabriel?
We ran out of time, really. Quite.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you to our three speakers, lovely speakers today, Clive, Connie, Marlotte. Thank you very much for joining us today, for sharing your experience, your knowledge, and your perspective on that market. We're still early stages, so a lot of things to do, together. So where we continue, I know we will continue working together in hands. But again, thanks to the attendees. The webinar is going to be available also as usual online later on our website. So don't hesitate to share this with your colleagues or your friends, for the one who were not able to attend. And we give you, but we say bye-bye, and until the next seminar, which is about a month ago, Gabriel, if I'm correct.
Yeah, that's right. October, see you all. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good job.